right, before I introduce John Perkins, I guess we have a couple of announcements to make. Tonight's lecture is part of Marlborough College's On the Record series of lectures, presentations, and performances, and is made possible by the Thomas Thompson Trust, which annually brings to campus speakers on controversial topics. We'd also like to thank all the people here at Marlborough that made this possible, especially Lynette Rummel and our president, Ellen, and Dan Cotter and his entire facilities team for all the work they did in getting this building ready for tonight. On the Record is going to continue this Sunday, May 4th, with a poetry reading by Hayden Carruth at 3 p.m. in Whittemore. And that Sunday, May 4th, will also be the day that we officially celebrate Marlborough College's 60th anniversary. We'll dedicate the Roderick M. Gander Center for World Studies, host a discussion panel with state legislators from Windham County, preview the Marlborough College's Early Voices documentary, and host a free community dinner complete with birthday cake. Everyone should also know that this is being filmed by the Brattleboro Community Television and Democracy Now!, and they'll be broadcast at a later date. And if you guys could not have any photography for the next 10 minutes at least, that'd be good. John's going to be answering questions after the talk, and he's going to be signing books outside afterwards if you guys have any questions. So John Perkins is an activist and an author, best known for Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which came out in 2004 and spent over a year and a half on the New York Times bestseller list. It's half memoir and half haunting critique of the expansion of global capitalism, and it chronicles his work, his rise through a strategic consulting firm based out of Boston, and his subsequent training as an economic hitman, where he worked with American intelligence agencies and multinational corporations to manipulate foreign leaders into following U.S. foreign policy and corporate interests. This book, as well as his newest one, The Secret of American Empire, reveals the grim underbelly of modern capitalism and neocolonialism, and the ways in which international economic institutions hide their bid for hegemonic dominance under a liberal smokescreen of structural adjustment policies and modernization. John's books should scare you because they prove the way, they show the way that the mechanics of inequality, the mechanisms of inequality buffer our lifestyles here in the States, and how there's a lot of inequality predicated on this. However, just talking to him in the last couple of minutes, it's very clear that this is not, while it is a very structural argument, it's not at all a message of apathy. And I think that you'll find out that John's message really is one of hope and of optimism and of a changing of social consciousness and even a changing of capitalism for the future. He's been called by some a vainglorious peddler of nonsense, and by others a modern hero who campaigns for social justice. So everybody, welcome John Perkins.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kevin. You didn't say which side of the fence you were on as to how I'm defined. I'd be interested to talk to you afterwards. Thank you, Marlborough College, for having me here this incredible day, and thank you, Lynette and Chris and Kevin and the Thompson Foundation. And especially thank you all for being here. If I had spent the winter here in Vermont this past winter, and there was an evening like this tonight, I don't believe I'd be sitting where you are right now. So I'm very, very deeply appreciative for all of you coming out in this magnificent weather and being here. And I think what we're talking about here tonight is a revolution. Not in America, it's happening in Asia and Africa, and it's happening here at home. and I'm feeling it very strongly, and I'll talk more about that as the night goes on. It's a revolution that's very, very badly needed, because I think we all know that this world is in a lot of trouble today. We all know about global warming. We all know that less than 5% of the world's population lives here in the United States and consumes more than 25% of our resources. We all know about the terrible things that our corporations are doing around the world. We know that there's more slavery today than there's ever been on this planet before. We know that we must turn things around. There has to be a revolution. We have to change this, and we're going to change it. And I grew up just across the river in New Hampshire. And I come from a long line of Vermonters. They go back way before the American Revolution. I grew up believing that Brattleboro and this whole area was the seat of the revolution, or at least one of those seats. That amazing things happened here and just down the road a piece in Bennington and on up the Champlain Valley and throughout this whole region. And this revolution happened not because people were desperate. The farmers that lived in this part of the world were not desperate farmers. They were better off than any other farmers in the world, much better off than the peasants of England where they'd come from. And this revolution didn't happen because the leaders of that revolution were impoverished people. George Washington was not impoverished. Thomas Jefferson was not impoverished. Hamilton was not impoverished. These were not desperate people. These were people with an ideal. These were people who believed that they could create a better world. These were people who believed that the current government that they had, which was the government of the most powerful empire in the history of the world at that time, the British government, their government, they believed that they could do something much better. And I think we're in that same position here now and today. We know that our government, we know that our leaders, our corporate leaders, our governmental leaders can do much better, and we're going to force them to do better. We're going to encourage them, we're going to inspire them, we're going to motivate them to do much better. And it's starting all over right now, and right here, tonight. I'm really looking forward to seeing this happen. My goal in being here tonight, my publishers think my goal is to sell books, but my goal is to convince you that when you leave here tonight, you're going to go out into this world and you're going to work even harder than you have been to create an environmentally sustainable, socially just, peaceful world for every child on this planet, whether that child is growing up in Africa, in Asia, the Middle East, Latin America, North America, or wherever that child is growing up. That together, you and I are going to walk out of this room and we're going to be committed. We're going to be determined to do the right thing, the practical thing, the pragmatic thing. We're going to create a world that's never been seen before, and it's going to be a world that really sees itself as a small community and realizes that in order for my grandson to inherit a good world, every child on this planet has to have that expectation. And so that's my goal here, and I feel so deeply honored. Tonight actually is the beginning of about a 6-week book tour that I'm starting because Secret History of the American Empire is just coming out in paperback next week. I don't know whether you've got copies in paperback out here yet or not, but anyway. And I find it extremely symbolic, and I'm deeply honored to be beginning this tour here in a part of the country that I see as the foundations of the earlier American Revolution, and to be here at a college that I have a tremendous admiration for what you do. A couple of years ago, I came here to your open house day for prospective students and spent a day wandering on your campus and meeting your professors, and I was kind of incognito at that time. I wasn't up here on a stage. And I was deeply, deeply impressed by this college. So to be beginning this next 6-week tour, which is a little daunting at times, here in this part of the country and at this college it touches my heart very, very deeply. And I thank you all for being here tonight. So as we move into this talk, and again, for me, the most important part of this is the optimism that we are going to change things, and to talk about what we each can do, where we can go from here, how we can turn this around. But before we get into that, I would like to share with you a little bit of the history of how we got here, which goes along with my own personal history. I think it's fair to say that since the end of World War II, and increasingly in the most recent decades, we have managed to create the world's first truly global empire. And it's the first empire that's been created primarily without the military. It's been created by economic hitmen, by people like what I once was. And we work many different ways, economic hitmen, but perhaps the most common is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. But the money never goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects, power plants, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit a few very rich people in that country, as well as our own corporations, but don't help the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity, don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks, don't own cars to drive on the highways. And yet those very people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt so that it can't pay for education and social services and health care for its people. In fact, the debt is so huge by intent that at some point we economic hitmen go back and we say, listen, you owe us a lot of money. You can't repay your debts, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies without regard to the environment. Vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote. Send troops in support of ours to some place in the world like Iraq. And in that way, we've created this empire. On the few times when we economic hitmen fail, as I talk about in the books, as I failed in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos and in Panama with Omar Torrijos, then the jackals go in. And these are men, maybe a few women, who overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. So if I'm unable to bring them around, if the economic hitman is unable to bring them around through legal means, what we do is we use legal means through the World Bank, but it's basically corrupting the leaders of these countries. If we're unable to corrupt them, then the jackals go in and take care of them. So when I failed with Jaime Roldos in Ecuador and Omar Torrijos in Panama, the jackals assassinated them. And if the jackals fail, which is what happened in Iraq, both the economic hitmen and the jackals failed with Saddam Hussein, then, and only then, does the military go in. So this is the first empire in the history of the world that's been created primarily without the military. The military only as a last resort. And I think there's something extremely dangerous about this. It's not just that it's pathetic, it's not just that it goes against all of our most sacred documents. It's extremely dangerous because we claim to be a democracy. And a democracy is built on the assumption that the electorate is informed. And if the electorate doesn't realize what we're doing internationally, if the electorate doesn't understand the main basis of our foreign policy, which is what I've just described, then the electorate is not informed and therefore cannot vote intelligently. And therefore you even have to question whether we're truly a democracy. Forget about Chads, don't forget about them, but in addition, I live today and most of the time, I still have a place in New Hampshire, but I spend quite a bit of the time closer to Latin America, living in Florida, Palm Beach, Florida, where we have a record of lousy elections, Palm Beach County. But I think more important than whether the last elections were stolen, whether the electoral system in terms of the machines we use to vote are working, even more important than that is the basic question: do we the people, we the voters, have any idea what we're voting for? And in the field of foreign policy, in the field of the World Bank, in the field of international finance and foreign aid, we don't, in general. And that's changing. Since I've been on this road tour, since Confessions came out in 2004, I've been pretty much traveling around a good share of the time during these last 3.5 years. I've seen a tremendous change. We are awakening. We are growing in our consciousness. And that gives me great optimism. So, I talk in The Secret History of the American Empire. It's divided into 5 sections. 4 of those sections regard 4 of the major areas of influence in the world today: Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and talk about the problems in each of those areas, which are quite different in the different areas, the opportunities in each which are different, but come down to point out that in the end, they're all coming together. We're really understanding that we're one world in this process. And the 5th section of The Secret History then deals with how, as we come together, we must move into changing that process, what we each can do, what you and I each can do to make this happen. And I don't have time tonight to go into all the 4 areas, so I'd like to talk primarily about Latin America tonight and then move into what we each can do. But Latin America today is the leader in the revolution. Marlborough College will be the leader here, but Latin America has taken an incredible leadership. In the last 4 or 5 years, 9 countries in Latin America have voted in the president who said no more exploitation by foreign corporations. These presidents have said the profits from Ecuador's oil must benefit Ecuador's poorest people. The profits from Bolivia's gas must benefit Bolivia's poorest people. The most recent of those elections was just last week in Paraguay. Paraguay, been run by Stroessner, an ex-Nazi. For years it was a neo-colonialism stronghold, and the election there was just won by a man who's known as the Bishop of the Poor. He was a Catholic bishop, had to drop out of that in order to run for politics, but he was the Bishop of the Poor. And we've seen now these countries represent more than 80% of the people of South America. And they have gone through a democratic process, every one of them, peaceful, and voted in these amazing men and 2 women in Chile and Argentina who have promised to help the poorest of the poor, to use local resources to do this. They've said, we do not want foreign aid. We don't need help. We have the resources. We just need to have the right to use those resources for our people. No more exploitation by foreign corporations. And I also want to say that during most of my lifetime, every one of these countries was run by a brutal dictator, a Washington puppet. Not anymore. That's all changed in this millennium. That's all changed in the last few years. And one of the reasons it's changed is because very diverse groups have come together to recognize that they have one common interest, and that is to create an environmentally sustainable, socially just, and peaceful world for themselves and their offspring in each one of these countries. For example, throughout history, the indigenous people in the military since the time of the conquest have been pretty much at war with each other in one way or another. In Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, and throughout the hemisphere, these 2 groups have come together. And they brought in the candidate who's promised to do something better. And in each time, this candidate has been up against an opposition who was supported by Washington. And in each time, the opposition candidate, the people's candidate, the anti-exploitation candidate has won. And I think this tells us something magnificent about this world we live in. If these diverse groups in Latin America that have been at each other's heads for so long can come together, then Sunnis and Shiites and Israelis can also come together to serve the best common interests of the Middle East. And the various diverse groups in the United States and in India and in China and Tibet can come together. We must see to it that that happens. And the leadership is being shown. A model has been developed in Latin America. So I think then we can look at something very, very positive that's happened in very recent history. And unfortunately, most people in the United States don't even know that this has happened. Most people don't know who Rafael Correa, the new president of Ecuador, is, or Evo Morales is, or Bachelet, the woman president of Chile, or Kirchner, the woman president of Argentina. These are not familiar names to many of us. I think in this room this is maybe an exception. And a guy like Rafael Correa has this PhD in economics from the United States. He speaks fluent English. He speaks it better than I do. He also speaks Spanish, and he speaks Quechua, the language of the indigenous people. And when he was elected president, his coronation occurred in a circle of shamans, indigenous shamans, in a little remote indigenous community outside Quito in the high Andes of Ecuador. He chose to go back to the indigenous people to legitimize his presidency. An amazing moment. It didn't make the New York Times, or a very, very small blurb one day, 3 days later on the back page. But we know it, and we can learn from it. It's an incredible time that's going on in the world today. And what I'm seeing happening in this country is phenomenal, I have to tell you. And I'm sure there's a lot of skepticism out there. I'm sure these current elections are discouraging a lot of people. I find them rather discouraging, that the candidates don't seem to be willing to talk about anything except what people running for president of third grade might talk about, which is, who tied their shoe wrong. That's a joke. You're allowed to laugh here tonight. Very serious audience here in southern Vermont. Yeah. We've still got a family farm in this state, incidentally, up near Randolph, Vermont. I've got a couple of second cousins up there that run a farm that's been in this family for a couple of centuries, I guess, at this point in time. And, all I can say about those cousins of mine is my hat's off to them, and they're extremely courageous, tenacious fellows, or else they're incredibly dumb. And I know they're not dumb. They're very courageous people to keep running that farm and surviving on it and doing a good job with it and producing some real good cheese, too, and maple syrup. So I lost my train of thought. I know, there was a little joke there. So as we move into this new era, as we feel what's going on around us, as we experience these feelings that we have around the election, around the global warming that we're pretty sure is happening despite the tough winter you guys just went through, it's easy to be discouraged. But last week, I was speaking at the Seattle Green Festival, first time they ever held one in Seattle. I spoke at the one in Chicago a year ago. We had 45,000 people there. The first one in Seattle, they were expecting maybe 10,000. I think they finally decided they had 30,000. I haven't even seen the latest figures. And it wasn't just that there were a bunch of pretty good speakers, but all out through there was this huge marketplace. People, entrepreneurs, who were coming up with incredible new products that have all been vetted by the Green Festival to be green, to be socially and environmentally responsible. And it just amazed me as I walked through this place to see what people are working on today and producing. We really are walking our talk, a lot of us, and I know it's easy to get discouraged, but when you see things like that, you realize that the human spirit is indomitable and what we're able to create. And none of us is doing it perfectly at this point in time. I flew on an airplane and I drove in a car to get here. That's not exactly a small carbon footprint. But I'm hoping I'm offsetting that, in addition to buying my carbon offsets, by talking to you tonight. And we all have to look at that balance. Amazing things are happening today. People are doing incredible things, and we really need to feel that and honor that and move forward into this new epoch. And so the rest of this talk, and I'd like to address what it is you can do, what each of us can do, how we can move forward with this, and then we'll go into questions and answers. But the real question is, what will you do? What will you do when you leave this room tonight? Why are you here tonight? Why did you come to this talk? And what will you do tomorrow and from then on? What will we each do? And I think one of the first and most important questions we have to ask is, what is it going to really take to turn this whole system around, to change this empire? Because we have to look at history and know that empires never succeed. They always collapse. And this one's in the throes of collapse right now. But I don't want it to collapse, for one, because when empires collapse, you get a void, and you get wars, either physical wars or economic wars, and you get a new empire. What we must do now is something that's never been done in history before, very much like what those people did here in the 1770s. We must create a new pattern, not let this empire be destroyed, collapsed, and replaced by another empire, but turn this thing around and create a new model. Because the fact of the matter is 5% of the world's population consuming more than 25% of its resources is not a successful model. It's a failure. You cannot sell that model to China or India or Africa or Latin America. You can't even keep doing it here. We know that. So we got to create something new. So let's not wait for the Chinese or someone else to do it. We need to make that happen. And one of the essential questions to ask here is, who's running it, and what's the power base? How do you go in? How do you change this? Well, an empire has an emperor. And an emperor is someone who's not elected, doesn't serve a limited term, and doesn't report to anyone. Well, I think even there's probably, I imagine in this room there's 1 or 2 Democrats out there probably. You are serious. I won't ask you to stand up because you might be embarrassed amidst all your fellows. But even I think the staunchest Democrats would agree that we do not have an emperor in our president. The president of this country, at least up until now, has always been elected, serves a limited term, and does theoretically report to someone, which these days seems to be the big corporations, but be that as it may, there's someone out there. But we do, in fact, have an emperor. It's what I call the corporatocracy. It's a group of people, a very large group of people, that runs our biggest corporations. Now, this is not a conspiracy theory. You don't need a conspiracy for all of these people to realize what they must do to keep those corporations running. They all work under one premise, one single goal that drives every one of them. And that is to maximize profits regardless of the environmental and social costs. Maximize profits regardless of the environmental and social costs. And they go about it differently. Exxon has a different approach from Nike, who has a different approach from Monsanto, has a different approach from whoever. But they're all aiming toward that same goal. And these people control our mainstream media. Thank God for Amy Goodman in Democracy Now! Yeah. Who's filming us right now, so you better clap. A little enthusiasm out there. But they control our mainstream media either through direct ownership or through their advertising budgets. They control our government, our politicians, because no politician can be elected these days without a lot of money. And most of that money comes from one way or another through the corporations. And so the corporations very much are in charge. And a few people run these corporations, what I call the corporatocracy. And again, this isn't a conspiracy theory. These people don't have to get together to conspire. They're all they know what the goal is out there. It's to maximize profits, regardless of social and environmental costs. And so they move in this direction. So how do we change this system? Oh, and incidentally, like emperors, they're not elected, they don't serve limited terms, and they don't report to anybody. They'd like to tell you they report to their boards of directors, but they're all on each other's boards, and they just rubber stamp each other. So how do we change this? Well, I think in a way we're extremely fortunate, because what we have today is an empire that's not been set up by the military. It's a commercial empire set up by economic hitmen. We don't have to defeat it militarily for the first time in history. Unlike our ancestors here in this valley before us, we don't have to pick up our flintlocks and go to war. Isn't that nice? We change it the same way that our neighbors to the south in Latin America and those 9 countries down there have changed it. We change it by the way we shop. We change it by the way we vote to a certain degree, but we have to recognize that no matter who gets elected president in this next election, that man or woman cannot do it by herself or himself. They need us out there. We must be the ones to do it. We have to be the ones to do it. What we must do is convince the corporations that they have to change the very premise, the very goals that they work under. So we can say to them, profits are okay, but only within the context of creating a socially just, environmentally sustainable, and peaceful world. Those must be the parameters. And we come up with a whole new set of accounting principles to take into account the externalities that aren't included now, like the health problems created in sweatshops around the world and all the damage to the rainforests that are being done by oil companies, et cetera, et cetera. But that becomes the goal. Profits, okay, but only within the context of creating an environmentally sustainable, socially just, and peaceful world. And I'm very, very optimistic that we can get these corporations to change, to accept that. I'm optimistic for a number of reasons. First of all, because we've been very successful at changing them on specific issues in the past, and I'm sure you've got examples right here. But when I was a student in Boston a couple of years ago, so long ago I can't even remember what the city looked like. You couldn't walk beside the Charles River because it stank so badly. And there were rivers in this country in the Midwest that were on fire with pollution, but we forced the corporations to clean them up. We were destroying the ozone layer with aerosol cans, but not anymore. We forced the corporations to open their doors wider to women and African Americans and other minorities. Kentucky Fried Chicken and McDonald's got rid of trans fats in their foods because we demanded it. And Tyson's Chickens just got rid of antibiotics in their chickens because we demanded it. We've done many, many other things. We've had a tremendous ability to turn these corporations around when we've decided that we want to do it. And now we just have to ratchet that up a notch. We can still go after some of those individual and specific issues, but the more important one is to send the message out to these corporations that they will not get their charters unless their main goal is to create a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. And we're not going to buy from any of the ones that aren't doing that. There's plenty of alternatives. I saw them at the Green Festival. I know Brattleboro's full of them. Vermont's one of the leading states in encouraging entrepreneurs in this area. There's a lot of alternatives to Nike and the others that use sweatshops. And so we must send that message out loud and clear, and we can bring these people around. Another reason I'm optimistic is because I know a lot of corporate executives, from CEOs on down. I have never met a corporate executive who wants to see Florida sink beneath the ocean, or who wants to see the ozone layer destroyed, or who wants to see more terrorism around the world. Every executive I've ever met wants to create a better world for his or her children, grandchildren, nephews, and nieces. There may be exceptions. There may be pathological personalities out there running our corporations, like I think Enron had a few of those. But I'd like to suggest that they're probably about the same proportion as in the general population. What is it? They say 1 out of every 15 people or so is a pathological personality. So, God, we got quite a few minutes right now. Probably the same is true of corporate executives. Watch out for your neighbor. Corporate executives are human beings like us, and they're looking to do the right thing, in my experience. And I want to share with you a little story. How many people here know of Rainforest Action Network? Okay, well, a few more of you need to, but a few years ago, Rainforest Action Network went after Mitsubishi, which at the time was considered the worst cutter of rainforest trees. Most people don't know that about Mitsubishi, but it's a big conglomerate. And Rainforest Action Network's never lost a campaign. They've tackled giants. Boise Cascade, and Citicorp, and Home Depot, and Kinko's, and McDonald's, and they've always won every single campaign. They went after Mitsubishi, and it became very contentious, a battle between the founder of Rainforest Action Network, Randy Hayes, and a senior executive at Mitsubishi. They locked horns. In the end, Rand won, as they always have, and got Mitsubishi to sign off on this agreement. And a few months later, I happened to be at a meeting where both of these men were there, a small meeting, about 30 people in California. And it was interesting to watch. And this meeting began Friday night. On Saturday morning, I was watching these two men who'd been clashing for so long. And I saw at one point they were both headed for the coffee urn, and they saw each other going for the coffee urn, and they both, bounced away real quick, like, magnets. And they avoided each other. Saturday night, Randy Hayes and I decided to go up to a hot tub on the top of the mountain nearby, and there was almost a full moon over the Pacific that night. We decided to take a six-pack of beer up and go into a hot tub and exchange wild stories about our escapades in the Amazon, where we both spent a lot of time. So we head up there, and we get to the hot tub, and there's already somebody in it. The Mitsubishi executive with his six-pack of beer. And I don't think he wanted to, but what can he say except, "Oh, come on in, guys." So Randy and I stripped down, and there's a full moon coming over the Pacific, and there's a couple of six-packs of beer, and we get in this hot tub, and we're naked. And I'm the only guy in between these two arch enemies. They've been ready to kill each other for months up until now, and I'm really wondering what the hell's going to happen next. Well, what happened was fascinating. And not too long after that, after a couple of beers, I suppose, the Mitsubishi executive raises his can of beer, and I'm sure it was Long Trail or BBC or one of these beers from here. They carried out to California. But anyway, he raises his can of beer, and he says, "Randy, I have to thank you. I have children. I hope to have grandchildren. I want to take them to the Amazon and the great forests of British Columbia and the Green Mountains." And a lot of other executives at Mitsubishi felt the same way. But we didn't dare do anything. We were just afraid we would lose our jobs if we rocked the boat. Until you and your people picketed us. And you and your people made our executive committee become aware that something had to happen. And then we could really move in and do the right thing. So I thank you, Randy. And I submit to you that all over this country, all over the world, there are a lot of executives in that same position. They want to do the right thing, but they're all operating under the assumption that they have to maximize profits regardless of the environmental and social costs. We need to convince them otherwise. We need to turn that around, and they're ready to be convinced. And incidentally, at that time, Rainforest Action Network operated on a budget of $2 million a year. They had 20 employees. And it doesn't take a lot of people to make this happen. You could get out there, just this group of people right here, around the clock. You could block Route 91 out here, I-91, and create a lot of havoc if you decided to do it. Don't say I suggested it. So I think this is a very, very doable thing. I think we're in an enviable situation today. We live in a real small planet. When I was an economic hitman in the 70s, it would take me 3-4 days to make a telephone call from Jakarta, Indonesia to Boston. Today it's instantaneous. Today you can send a whole book from the deepest part of the Amazon by internet to any place in the world. We're a very, very small planet. As I look out over this room, I dare say that probably just about every country in the world, and certainly every continent in the world, is represented in one way or another here by some item of clothing, by a person, by a piece of jewelry, by something. We're a very, very small interdependent planet. We have tremendous communication. And this puts us in a position to really, really affect change. To create something that's never been done before in the history of the world. You and I can each do that. We're in that position. And so the final question to ask ourselves, and then we'll move into your questions and answers, and the final question to ask ourselves is how can we do it? How can each of you as an individual do this? What is it you can do? And in The Secret History of the American Empire, there's a long list of things we can all do and should do, and I suspect in this room there's a lot of people that are already doing them, not buying from sweatshops, drinking water like this, the important way to drink water, the right way to drink water. You get really good water here. Nice bouquet. I've been traveling around drinking a lot of water, and some of it's not so good in this country, but yours is nice. Well, that's the right way to drink water, and this is the wrong way, right? No bottled water, carry your own around, have your own bottle, but fill it at the tap, and if your own water system in your town isn't doing a good job, get them to do a good job, because importing water from Fiji is not the answer. The other day I did a talk like this, and I was sitting out, as I will tonight later, at the table outside signing books, and this young man comes up to me and he says, "Thank you so much for saying that. I'm from Fiji." And he said, "We're a dry country. We don't have much water. We're sending it all, and what we do have, we're sending it all to you. Thank you for saying that." So anyway, there's this list in the book, and it's a long list of many, many things that we all should be doing and can do. But I think beyond that, there's something very important, and that is that each of you has passion, and each of you has talent. And so what's most important is that you use your talents to follow your own passions. Because if we don't follow our passions, we're probably not going to be successful or stick to it very long anyway. So we're all different that way. I mean, I have a passion to write and hopefully some talents. So I use them that way. But whatever your passions are, follow them and your talents. And there's so many examples of how we can take that path. If we can all take different paths, but if we're all headed toward the same destination, and that destination is to create an environmentally sustainable, my mantra, socially just and peaceful world, then we can all take different paths headed in for that same destination, and we will get there. I am so often struck by what happened here in the 1770s. I think it's a great inspiration for where we are today. And I'm so often struck by the fact that George Washington did not write pamphlets. And Tom Paine did not try to lead armies. Thank God. Paine followed his passion as a writer, and Washington followed his passion as a leader of men. And they took very different paths, and their wives, or at least Washington's wife, took a very different path and was very influential in this. But they were all headed toward the same destination. And we too can move in that direction. And there's so many examples. I mentioned all these people at the Green Festival. I mentioned a lot of the entrepreneurs here. In my book, The Secret History of the American Empire, I talk about a young couple who comes from this area, lives here now, that spent time in Africa as Peace Corps volunteers and created a nonprofit organization called Ecoval Mali, which is aiming at helping the small farmers of Africa, of Mali and of Africa. And I think, Cindy and Greg, are you here tonight? If you are, would you stand up? Hi. Fantastic. And I had lunch today, and Greg was telling me how terribly important it is to follow his heart, and how difficult it is at times. He has to have they both have to have other jobs in addition to this nonprofit in order to make that happen, but they're determined to make it happen. But what's really important is that they follow their passion and use their talents. And I think You'll both maybe be outside near the table where I'm going to be signing later if people want to talk to you about what you're doing. Could you just stand up again and let people see you so they'll know who to turn around so they can see you? All right. Woo! And I'm a founder and on the board of a nonprofit organization which is also based near here, down near Northampton, Massachusetts. Dream Change, which is about changing the paradigm, changing the dream, and it grew out of indigenous teachings. And the director of that organization is also with us tonight, Lynn Roberts, along with her son Evan. Would you both of you stand up, please? Thank you. And I single them out. This room is full of people like that. I know that. I know there's a lot of you out there, and it's always a little risky to single anybody out. But I do that simply to point out again that these are two very different routes, and there's many other different routes. Like the people that are a good friend of mine who's making organic recycled hiking boots and bags, and people that are doing all the amazing stuff with food that goes on here with local farmers. There's so much that's going on in that way. But once again, encouraging you to follow whatever your passion is and use your talents to make that happen. And I think it's important, though, to always recognize that part of the goal here has to be to change our corporations. It has to be to get our corporations to redefine their goal as being they can create profits, but only if it's headed toward an environmentally sustainable, socially just, and peaceful world. And I'd like to just talk a little bit more about that. I just recently returned from Nicaragua, Panama, and other parts of Latin America. And one of the reasons I was there in Nicaragua is I was with a group of very wealthy philanthropists from the United States who want to invest philanthropically. In other words, they're not looking for a rate of return on their capital, but they want to invest in small farmers, the campesinos. They want to help the campesinos develop an organic food industry in Nicaragua. They want to support the Ortega government there, which is not supported by the U.S. government, and they want to support the people there trying so hard to make a new life for themselves, and through organic farming. And part of this team includes the founder and also the president, two separate people of Whole Foods, who were interested in buying the produce from them, and the Omega Institute up here in Rhinebeck, New York, that's also interested in buying from them. And so there's a whole system set up. But I made several trips to Nicaragua looking at this, and one of the discouraging things is that you find in Nicaragua that a great deal of the agricultural land there has been destroyed by U.S. corporations, by Chiquita and Dole and United Brands, or United Fruit formerly, by their pesticides and insecticides and so on. And but that land can be cleaned up. And the huge lakes, Nicaragua has two huge lakes. You can't see across them, Lake Managua and Lake Nicaragua, and they have a tremendous water supply, which is a very valuable resource for the future, as we all know. They're horribly polluted. But there's a boat you can buy for $40 million that cleans water very nicely. And there's tremendous opportunities. And I'm so struck as I'm in these places by the possibilities of creating a new economy. So what if a small percentage or a large percentage of our military budget went to paying the very same corporations that today are making weapons to create the means to clean up the farmlands of Nicaragua and the waters of Nicaragua, and the farmlands of Africa and Asia, and the waters and the air? What if we determined to build an economy not on death and war as our economy is currently structured, but rather on life and on creating a better world for every child on this planet? What if we made that decision? Is that such a remote possibility? I don't think so. I think it's something we can do. And I think it's something we should insist that our presidential candidates in this next election that's so close upon us now talk about, rather than who ties their shoe wrong. Let's get them to really talk about these issues. Let's create a new economy together. Let's insist upon that. And you have tremendous power every time you shop. And again, I feel here in this part of Vermont, this part of the country, I'm kind of like, I'm preaching to the choir. But sometimes the choir doesn't always sing. So it's good to preach to the choir too. I don't always sing, I know, we all make a lot of mistakes. But we have such tremendous power. You have incredible power, much more than you probably are willing to admit. But you have incredible power. And I'm often recalled to a time in my childhood when I had no idea that African Americans, this microphone's giving me a hard time, how's that? I had no idea that African Americans had to ride on the back of a bus in parts of my country until Rosa Parks showed me that. How many people here have ever heard of Rosa Parks? Okay, well, who the hell was Rosa Parks? Yeah, she's you. You can ride on the front of a bus. Now, what's also interesting is that in Montgomery, Alabama, where that happened, shortly after that, a group of church people got together and they started an organization because of Rosa Parks, and they elected as president of that organization Martin Luther King Jr. Rosa Parks, in a her own way, brought in Martin Luther King Jr. And she had been connected with the civil rights movement for a long time. It's not true that she was just a tired woman who wouldn't give up her seat on the bus. She'd had a lot of background, as we all do. But you are Rosa Parks. You can ride on the front of a bus. It may take a little courage, but you can do it. And when I was a kid growing up in New Hampshire, I had no idea that the DDT that we were spraying on the swamp out behind our house to kill mosquitoes was also killing insects and fish, until Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. How many people here have heard of Rachel Carson? Okay, great. And Rachel Carson, with that one book, started an entire global environmental movement. Who was Rachel Carson? You're Rachel Carson. You can do that. And, you know, Jack Woodbury and Mrs. Schneer and Richard Davis. How many of you people have heard of any one of those people? Richard Davis, Jack Woodbury, or Mrs. Schneer? Anybody? Oh my God. I can see a couple of hands. You must have heard me speak before. They were teachers of mine. Mrs. Schneer was my third grade teacher. Jack Woodbury was a high school history teacher, and Richard Davis was a high school English teacher. They totally changed my life. Mrs. Schneer, third grade teacher, taught me to stand up to a bully, kick him in the shins and run like hell. But it changed him. He no longer bullied me. He became my ally. If it weren't for Mrs. Schneer and Jack Woodbury and Richard Davis, I would not be standing here before you tonight. I'd be quaking in my boots, you know. And they don't know this. They don't know what an impact they've had. My books have now sold millions of copies in, I don't know, more than 30 languages. And Mrs. Schneer, my third grade teacher, has to take all the credit for that, or a great deal of it, and I'm serious. You have no idea how you're impacting people every single day, every day. And every time you shop and every time you eat, we have such incredible power, whether we're a third grade teacher or whether you're a dentist who, you know, when you got the drill in somebody's mouth, you convince them how to vote next time. Whether you're a carpenter or a plumber or a housewife, retired. I see some people I suspect may be retired out there. My generation, you know, the 30 and older group. You think I look younger than 30, don't you? That's how you're laughing. You know, if you're retired, you can't be fired. You got nothing to lose. Rock the boat. Rattle the cage. This is your time to get out there and change the world. You know, and they're probably not going to put you in jail either. You just kind of hobble around a little bit and look really fragile. It's, you know, they don't want you in the jail. So this is your time. Get out there, and if you're young, if you're just in college, this is the time to really decide that you're going to devote your life to your passion. You're not going to do anything but that. You're really going to go for your passion. Kevin and I were talking about that before the meeting, before he introduced me tonight. So this is an amazing time in history. It's a time that's been prophesied by indigenous cultures around the world. What's going on here? As being a time of the potential for tremendous change. And I think we're really feeling that now. It's happening. You know, if when Confessions of an Economic Hitman came out in 2004, I think I might have had half of you here in this room, maybe a quarter, I don't know. I used to get good audiences back then, and as the book started to take off, more and more people, and I used to get a lot of the same kind of simplistic questions from the audience. We'll see about you guys in a little bit. But now, things have really changed. Things are really taking off. And I take all the credit for it. No, the fact of the matter is, there's a tremendous number of books, movies, Syriana, Hotel Rwanda, Blood Diamond, on and on. Al Gore's movie. There's a tremendous awakening that's going on. We are on the verge of a magnificent change. Gesundheit. And that just ushered it in. That's what the shamans call a real cleansing. So I'm going to open this up to questions in just a moment, but before I do, I would like to leave you with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. And I have to say that it's a frightening endeavor to stand before a microphone and read the words of Martin Luther King Jr., because who can possibly even think about reading them the way that he would have spoken them? I won't even try, but I will read the words. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I refuse to accept the view that mankind is so tragically bound to the starless midnight of racism and war that the bright daybreak of peace and brotherhood can never become a reality. I refuse to accept this view. I believe instead that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word. Unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word." We're moving into this era where unconditional love and unarmed truth are so important. It's time that we really, each of us, committed to devoting the rest of our lives to spreading this unarmed truth, to opening ourselves to this unconditional love and spreading that too. And so together, you and I, as we walk out of this room tomorrow, as we face the dawn tomorrow, and as we move forward in time, must commit ourselves to doing the right thing. It's the ethical thing. It's the practical thing. It's really the only thing to do. It involves changing consciousness. It involves changing the paradigm. It involves getting our corporations to commit to only working within the conditions of creating a sustainable, stable, and peaceful world. It includes each and every one of us committing to following our passions, using our talents to realize those passions, and always having those passions aimed at that destination of arriving at an environmentally sustainable, socially just, and peaceful world. And I know that as we leave this room and march out together, we will make this happen, just as those people back in the 1770s created a magnificent change. And I very much look forward to doing this with you. And I thank you all for joining me in that process and for being here tonight. Thank you. Thank you. The question was, thank you very much. Assuming that we can turn the corporations around, and I've been asked to repeat these questions for everyone and also for the Democracy Now! People. Assuming we can turn them around because they control the democratic process, in essence, won't this basically turn against us? How do we keep this? How do we keep the democracy in place even if we can turn the corporations around? Is that how do we, the people, determine our livelihoods? The corporations are totally dependent on us to buy everything they make. and to work for them. They can't do anything without us. And huge corporations have gone down, no longer exist. For example, does anybody out there remember what the big international corporation that brought down Salvador Allende, the president of Chile, what was the name of the corporation? Well, Anaconda was involved, but there was another... ITT. Thank you, yes, International Telephone and Telegraph Corporation. And Harold Janine was the chairman of the board. He's on the cover of Time magazine. He was one of the most powerful men in the world at the time. Who's ever heard of ITT today? It exists, but it's a very, very small company, and yet it had the power to bring in the CIA and take out Salvador Allende and kill him, essentially. You know, Pan American Airlines used to be a very powerful company. It doesn't exist anymore. There are a lot of, you just go on and on with the list. They're terribly dependent on us. You know, it's the corporations that have changed democracy. It's not Congress. Congress is beholden to the corporations, as is the president, and the president's also beholden to Congress to a certain degree. You know, Bush couldn't be getting away with the things he's getting away with today if the Democrats weren't going along with an awful lot of it. And why are they going along with it? Primarily because a lot of their money comes from the corporations too. So if we can turn those corporations around, we're going to change things. You know, the old world view, the geopolitics of the world as I grew up with it, was a big globe with 180 some odd countries, and a few of those countries influenced their neighbors. Most didn't, but a few did: the United States, the Soviet Union, a few others. But today we have a totally different geopolitics. No country is really very important, really, from the standpoint that you might better envision the geopolitics as these huge clouds enveloping the globe, and those are the big corporations, and they don't know any national boundaries, and they're really running everything. And they'll partner with the Chinese, they'll partner with the Argentines, they'll partner with the U.S. government, they'll partner with whoever they want, and they'll follow whoever's laws best serve them. They are truly running this thing. We're at a point today that's very much like what happened when the nation states, when the city-states became nations. We're taking another leap where the nations no longer are very relevant. What's relevant is the big corporations. So we must go after them. And they are very vulnerable to us. Unlike those old city-states or nation-states, they're not based on armies so much as they are on buying power. And we have a tremendous impact on their buying power. I mean, just look at today, you're seeing a real greening among corporations. Oh, it's only a small percentage at this point, but it's a lot more than it was 10 years ago. And I think to a large degree the greenwashing is kind of subsiding. They're realizing that that's not really working very well, and that they're really going to have to go into doing some greener things, and they're taking it kind of slowly. We've got to push them harder, but it is happening. And these entrepreneurs that are coming up with alternatives, and the stores that are selling organic produce and locally produced produce are having an impact. There's no question. We do have that power. Thanks for asking that.
Georgios?
Yeah, I'd like to sort of because all these big corporations are sort of hard to get at. The Harbor College itself is a corporation, and we don't invest with, I've done work with CT, and we don't invest with green practices as socially sustainable practices as the number one what's motivating. Profit is the number one motivator. And it's understandable because we're a small college, we have $30 billion endowment. It's just very small, we're very vulnerable. So I guess I want to know, first of all, I want to know how a small corporation, which is very vulnerable to fluctuations in the economy or whatever, can go green sort of safely. And then I want to sort of challenge students to, you're trying to get us active. I want to challenge students to put the pressure on the administration it's a very easy, small corporation, $30 billion, put it, make it I guess. But I want to know, I guess, how can we do that safely?
It's a great practical question, and I appreciate it. And I think there's an awful lot of answers to that question depending on, what corporation you're looking at. So, you could talk to Greg and Cindy about how they're doing it with African farmers. You could talk to some of the people at the Green Festival about how they're doing it with shoes or purses or different kinds of foods or all kinds of things that they're making. and it would be different. And a lot of it just really requires following your passion and sticking to it, and recognizing that along the line you're probably going to have to make some compromises. To get to the university situation, I think it is very important that students demand that their university be socially and environmentally responsible. And you've got to recognize, of course, that may take a little time and there may be some compromises along the line, but at least set that as a goal, as an objective. I'm struck by the Omega Institute, which is over here in Rhinebeck, New York, and their dedication to making their campus a lot greener. And they realize that they can't do it all at once, and it's going to take time, and I think that's always true. But making that commitment and moving forward, and for the students to keep the pressure on that, to point out that that's a very, very important aspect, that's essential. And you know, when a college, when Marlborough does that, and moves into that space, it's going to get a lot of attention. You know, the people who are on the forefront are always the winners, however we define winner. But so during the time when the city-states became nations, those people like the Medici, who understood that that was happening and got on the forefront of it, thrived. And so today a college like Marlborough can cut a tremendous place out for itself and become very highly recognized if it's willing to move into that forefront. And it has to do it carefully, and it has to do it strategically. And I would suggest that, you know, the college and student body work together, some sort of committee to really look at that, and maybe it becomes part of the course curriculum, to really look at how you can do that in a way that will not sink the college, obviously, because that's no good. You've got to be sustainable on that level too, but in a way that's truly, truly significant. And once that commitment is made, the solutions will come forward. They always do. I'm totally convinced of that. When we commit to doing something like that and following our passions, and we could put our talents, and you've got lots of talent in all kinds of regions in this university, in this college. When that commitment is made and those talents come together to realize that commitment, it will happen. And it will set a model for the rest in a very similar way to what's happened in Latin America, which is setting an incredible model. And it hasn't been easy for them. Thanks.
Well, it sounds to me like you think a revolution will come through shopping, and that most of you have purchasing power. And so I'm wondering, for all the people who don't have enough money to buy greens, what are they supposed to do?
That's a question, it's a good one. I've heard it before. And I think what we need to look at is buying green as an investment. And I'll give you an example. My daughter, who's 25, works for a nonprofit organization, doesn't make a lot of money, just had a baby. He's 7 months old now. And she's very, very environmentally conscious and socially conscious. And I remember at one point, as an example, she's looked at everything, diapers, the whole works. And at one point she called me and she said, "Dad, I found a couple of cribs. One's $200, it's made in China, probably in a sweatshop. I don't know that for sure, but I suspect. And another one that's made with Chilean certified organic, whatever, woods, and made in Canada, not in a sweatshop, for $600. And of course I'm going to buy the $600 one, because that $400 is an investment in my child's future. And I would put that into a school. It's not easy for her. She works for a nonprofit. She doesn't make a lot of money. But she's saying that's an investment. It's not a sacrifice. I'm investing in my child's future. And I think that's a really good way to look at it. To also realize that we can't always make an investment. So there may be times when you can't do the right thing. But to realize that in doing that other thing, you are sacrificing the future, your own future, your potential children's future, the future of the planet. There's a sacrifice that's being made by not doing the right thing, and you may have to do that from time to time. We all have to sometimes make sacrifices that way. But to also make the commitment that as soon as you can, you will make the right investment, which is an investment in the future. Thanks.
Can you talk about the current world food crisis and how the policies of the empire led to this, and what solutions you see to get us out of it?
Yeah, wow, what a tragedy this is. We talk about the energy crisis. The food crisis is really coming to a head now, and they're tied together, of course. And part of the food crisis is the high price of oil, and it's also the fact that so much land is now being turned into biofuels. And instead of being used to produce food for people, we're now producing biofuels. And this whole biofuels thing is tragic in many respects. It's not the answer to our energy problem. Solar and many other things and efficiency are the answer. But most biofuels these days result in the destruction of rainforests or farmlands, which creates more carbon dioxide, which takes away from fuel. But of course, biofuels are very attractive to the oil companies because biofuels require pipelines and they require stations that pump biofuels if they're done on a massive scale. The oil companies can control that. In fact, they'd probably rather have biofuels than oil because it's really easier to exploit rainforests to grow biofuels. Just cut down the trees and plant something else. You don't have to go in with big derricks and dig holes, and it's always the possibility you won't find any oil, but you know you can create palm oil in almost any rainforest. So the whole biofuels industry is just feeding into the oil industry. So you've got those two factors, the increased price of oil, which affects insecticides and fertilizers and transportation, and the biofuels business, and then you also have some radical climate conditions around the world, and you have the growth of China, and a huge growing demand for meats and other products that the Chinese see as being, the step up in development. And yet at the same time, we're still subsidizing agriculture in this country in a big way and hurting the small farmers or all the farmers of Africa and South America and so many other places as a result of that. We talk about free markets. We don't have any free markets because we're subsidizing. These are artificially low prices, and that's something that Cindy and Greg work on a lot in Africa. They can speak more intelligently about that than I can if you want to talk with them afterwards. But this whole process we're going through, and I'm struck in how in this election, why aren't any of the candidates really talking about these things? Why aren't they talking about the true energy issues? And the immigration issue, they make it sound like it's going to be solved by passing certain laws or building walls or not building walls. But the real immigration problem is that the free trade agreements have destroyed the economies of Central America. I was just there. These economies are wrecked. And those people cannot make a living, so they come here. They don't want to be here. I speak Spanish fluently. I talk to a lot of these people. I've never met a Guatemalan or a Mexican laborer in this country who wants to be here. They live in beautiful countries. They want to go home to their families. But there's no jobs there because the corporatocracy has destroyed them. We really need to address these issues, and we need to insist that Obama and Hillary and McCain all really start to address these true issues. So get out there and insist on this. Write letters, send emails to whoever your candidate is and say, I want to vote for you, but for me to vote for you, you've got to start really looking at the real issues, not just the little cosmetic areas around the issues, but look at the real issues. What is, Iraq's there. We got to get out. We all know everybody knows we got to get out of Iraq. The question is how, but the real question is, why did we get in there? Why is there terrorism in the world? There's terrorism in the world because there's desperate people, starving people, unhappy people. I've known terrorists. I've talked to a lot of terrorists. I've never met a terrorist who wants to be a terrorist. I know there are fanatical people out there. There are serial killers. There are crazy people. There will always be people like that. Maybe Osama bin Laden's one of them. I don't know. But what I do know is nobody follows those people unless they're desperate. And the terrorists today are desperate people. I've known a lot of the Colombian terrorists. I got an email from Raul Reyes. You may remember he was just shot, and he and 20 other guys in Ecuador when the Colombian army came in. He sent me an email just a few weeks before he was killed. This man, FARC is a bad organization. There's a lot of bad people in FARC. But he was in Ecuador to try to strike a peace deal. Uribe of Colombia does not want a peace deal because Uribe of Colombia receives more foreign military aid than anybody else in South America. I think anybody else in the world except Israel. He doesn't want peace. Why aren't our candidates talking about that? I don't think that even addresses your question. But I think I answered it at the beginning, right? Yes, we have to get the word out there, and we have to insist that our corporations change. For example, Coca-Cola is doing very bad things in Colombia. Don't drink Coca-Cola, and tell them why you're not drinking it, because, you know, they're behind killings in Colombia, and we can't prove that the actual Coca-Cola corporation is, but a lot of strange things are happening. And, you know, let them know why you're not going to buy Coca-Cola. Let Nike know that even though they're becoming greener, and they are, you still don't like their sweatshops, and you're going to buy from somebody else who doesn't have sweatshops, even if it costs a little more, and let the people you buy from know why you're buying from them. The solution is that we have to talk to each other a lot more, and we have to follow our talk with our actions, and we have to let those people know why we're doing this. They're human beings. They don't want to be rejected. How many people here like being rejected? Okay, they don't either. So start rejecting them. Thanks. We got a lot of problems in the world, overpopulation, overpollution, and so on and so forth. How do we change all that? It's a great question, and I think I have to say at this point that having written these couple of books which have become good sellers, and I stand up here and talk, and I encourage everybody to go out and do your thing, I'm not pretending to be God, and I don't know a lot of these answers. Good. Then why are you asking me a question like that? What I want to challenge you to do is just because I don't have a beard, is find the answer to that. That's your passion. My passion is writing these books. It's challenging you to ask that question, and I don't know the answer to it. The population problem is a huge one. First of all, we have to address it. And it's almost, you know, people just don't talk about it. You know, it's the skeleton in the closet, that you go to all these conventions and people don't talk about it. I think it's important that you get people to talk about it. And so I really, you know, it's your passion. Get out and really delve into that. And I'd just like to suggest that to all of you, you know, challenge you with that yeah, I don't pretend to have a lot of these answers. I'm a writer, as I said. That's where my passion is, and inspiring. But there's a lot of people here that have a lot of answers to these questions, or the beginnings. And if you think you have an answer, if you have a suspicion, if you say to yourself, why don't they do it this way, then you're on the right track. Oh, that is a very good answer, that if you have the ability to grow your own food, do it. But there's a lot of people in Harlem and in Roxbury and in many other parts of our big cities that will have a very difficult time doing that. Yes. That's right. So we have to help figure out that answer. And I think if we continue to push toward an environmentally sustainable, socially just, and peaceful world, if we all set that and we take these different routes and work toward helping them, you get the answer for you, but work toward getting it for other people who are less fortunate than you and don't live in Vermont. I'd really encourage you to do that.
You mentioned NAFTA earlier and the negative effects, NAFTA and CAFTA and the negative effects that they collectively had for Central America. How do you feel about the Zapatistas in southern Mexico? Do you feel as though these alternative governments that have risen up in regions affected by these NAFTA and CAFTA, are they positive, or is it negative, or is it just too soon or complicated to say?
You know, it's really hard to say with every specific one. I was in Colombia in the early 70s when FARC came into existence. And FARC came into existence, and for those of you who don't know, FARC is a very dangerous organization in Colombia now, a terrorist organization, but it came into existence because it didn't like the hydroelectric plants we were building, and a bunch of campesinos were flooded out. Their lands were destroyed, and the oil companies were doing something similar. So they banded together to try to stop that. And in the initial years, they got funding from Russia and some from China. And that sustained them. And then that funding dried up, and especially as détente occurred, it dried up more and more. And so they turned to narco-trafficking and extortion and kidnapping, which is pretty bad stuff. But that was the only way they saw that they could fund themselves. So what started off as, I think, is a very positive movement, a grassroots movement to object strongly to World Bank projects and oil company projects, became something that's pretty dark now and pretty dangerous. And so it's always hard to know where those things are going to go. I think we here, as a people, one of the messages that we need to get from South America is that we all need to really insist that our government and our corporations defend democracy. So right now, these countries, these 9 countries today in Latin America, 8 are in South America, 1 in Central America, and Guatemala and Mexico are kind of, they waver a little bit in there. It's not quite clear where they're going. But I think we all need to support these democracies, and we need to insist that our country and our corporations support democracy in these countries and all around the world, even when democratically elected presidents threaten to rein in our corporations and cut down on the billions of dollars the chief executive offices are making. We need to insist on democracy, and so I encourage you, to get out there and talk about this more, write about it, write to your Congress people, talk on the radio. Yes. Yes. Ultimately, it is going to do it. We are going to do it if enough of us, when enough of us, get out there and really make it happen. When we really want it to happen, it will happen. There's no question about it in my mind. It will happen, just as it has in South America. If you'd lived in Ecuador 7 years ago, you wouldn't have believed that Rafael Correa could ever be president of Ecuador. You wouldn't believe that Ecuador would today, both the president and the Congress, 2 weeks ago, the Congress stood behind the president and said, no, the background on this is the largest U.S. military base in Latin America is in Ecuador. And Rafael Correa said he will not renew the lease in 2009 unless the United States gives him the same amount of land and a lease in Florida to build an Ecuadorian military base in Florida. And the Congress of Ecuador just supported him with a unanimous vote 2 weeks ago. You would not have conceived of that happening 7 years ago in Ecuador. Things have changed because people like you and you and you and you and you all got together and made it happen. And we can make that happen here too, and we're going to. Thanks. One more.
He's got a good last question.
John, I know you've had some experience with indigenous cultures and shamanism, and I didn't know if you wanted to share how that has affected sort of who you've become, because you sort of, used to do something quite different.
Yeah.
I'm just curious of how that related to your life now.
Well, to start with, I was a Peace Corps volunteer with indigenous people in the Amazon and Andes before I was an economic hitman. And I think I was only an economic hitman for 10 years, which is far too long. But over that period of time, I think increasingly, I was being told that the stuff I was doing was good for development, good for poor people, and I bought into it. Business school had taught me that, and kept being told it, but in my heart, it gnawed at me. And one of the reasons I think I was privileged where other people in my position might not have been was that I'd lived with these indigenous people. And I really understood that the trickle-down effect probably wasn't happening, though I wanted to convince myself that it was, but over time I more and more saw that. So having lived with these indigenous people, speaking Spanish and some other languages, I could really get in touch with that, and over time it became clear to me that what we were doing was wrong. The other side of that coin is the indigenous people and the shamans teach us that the world is as you dream it. It's the title of one of my earlier books, The World is As You Dream It. It's a shamanic belief, and that what we dream, we create. And the shamans will tell you that here in the north, we have had a dream of big buildings, lots of industries, lots of cars, and our dreams come true because we gave it energy. And now we need to change that dream. That's the name Dream Change, one of the nonprofits. To change that dream, and once we start to give energy to the new dream, it will happen. So the new dream is to create a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. And if we all dream that, not just at night, but in all of our actions, and give energy to it by shopping properly whenever we can, and by doing all the other things along that line, and by forcing the corporations to go into that, as we have this dream, it will materialize. And I totally believe that, and indigenous cultures around the world have lived that way for much longer than we've lived this way. And they've done it very successfully, and even despite all the exploitation, they've managed to survive. They're still there. So it's been very profound. And that was, I think that was a great closing question, and we will do some book signing. If any of you want to share something out there, I'd love to do that. And just once again, in closing, I'd just like to say to you that I really, really look forward to moving out into this new time, this new dream, to sharing this dream together of a environmentally sustainable, socially just, and peaceful world. And as we dream that dream together, and as we give that dream energy, it will happen. Thanks.